I used to think my neighborhood was peaceful. You know the type, white picket fences, morning joggers with earbuds, and the occasional kid screaming about lemonade stands. Life was simple, predictable, and most importantly, mine. That all changed the day Karen decided my life was her personal project. Karen was the HOA president. Not just any HOA president, oh no, she was the kind who could turn a slightly crooked mailbox into a full-blown federal case in her mind. She wore her power like it was a crown, even though most of us tolerated it with eye rolls and forced smiles. At first, I tried to be polite, I nodded at her emails, fixed the tiniest things she complained about, and even tried to avoid running over her prized petunias with my lawnmower. I thought that would be enough. I was wrong. It started innocently enough. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found a letter with urgent stamped in big red letters. The paper was thin, cheap, and screamed passive-aggressive authority. Karen had decided my lawn gnome, a tiny wizard holding a broom, was unsuitable for our community aesthetics. Unsuitable, I couldn't even tell if she was serious or just testing my patience. But her words burned, immediate removal required, failure to comply may result in penalties. I laughed aloud in my driveway. Neighbors stared. I imagined them thinking, suburban drama, nothing unusual. But as much as I laughed, a tiny voice in the back of my head whispered, this is only the beginning. Over the next week, Karen's obsession escalated. Emails became texts, texts became calls, and calls, well, they became little bursts of pure irritation, always starting with I noticed, and ending with please rectify immediately. One night, I woke up to find a notification from my HOA app. Karen had posted a public comment under my house's listing. The gnome is still there, this is unacceptable. I sat in the dark, staring at my phone, wondering if she even slept. The funny thing is, I had a sense of humor about it. I mean, who would? Here was a grown woman meticulously policing garden ornaments as if she had been elected mayor of the world. But humor has its limits, especially when your peace is being invaded daily. And that's when the first warning signs of real trouble appeared. One Friday afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Karen, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose like she was about to film a reality show. Good afternoon, she said, in that tone that implied I had committed a felony simply by existing. I'm here to inspect your property, it's for compliance purposes. I froze, my inner monologue screamed, wait, is she coming in? But I forced a smile. Of course, I said, stepping aside. She peered around the yard, squinting at my gnome as if it had personally offended her family lineage. Karen's movements were exaggerated, almost theatrical. She measured the distance between my gnome and the mailbox, tapped on the mailbox, and scribbled furiously on her clipboard. I tried to stay calm, offering neutral comments. Yes, it's exactly 3.7 feet from the curb. She ignored me. I swear she didn't even see me. She was lost in a world where she was the sole judge of right and wrong. Then she said it, I may have to take further action if this is not resolved. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what further action meant. Fines, lawsuits, secret HOA assassins. I watched her leave, thinking the nightmare would pause. It didn't. In fact, it was only getting started. Because the next time I would see Karen, she wouldn't just be standing on my lawn or sending ominous emails. She would cross a line she didn't even know existed. A line that involved real authority and real consequences. A line that I couldn't believe she was about to cross. And that's when I realized, Karen wasn't just obsessed with the rules. Karen was obsessed with me, and if she thought she could intimidate me, well, she was about to learn that some people are immune to garden-variety tyranny, especially when the stakes are about to get a lot higher. I thought I'd seen the worst of Karen, but I was naive. The next week, the emails stopped being polite suggestions and became what I can only describe as passive-aggressive battle plans. Each message was more absurd than the last. She demanded that my lawn gnome be removed, that my mailbox be perfectly aligned to community standards, and my personal favorite, that my driveway be sufficiently reflective for optimal neighborhood aesthetics. I wasn't sure if she had invented new HOA rules on the fly or had just fallen into some kind of suburban delusion vortex. I replied once politely. I said, noted, I'll adjust accordingly. Big mistake, that was like waving a red flag at a bull. The next morning, I found a knock on my door, again. And there she was, Karen, clipboard in hand, sunglasses like she was about to take the world into custody, standing on my front porch with the kind of expression reserved for generals surveying a battlefield. Only this battlefield was my perfectly harmless yard. Good afternoon, she began like a court bailiff announcing a verdict. I'm here to inspect your property again. It's come to my attention that your gnome is still present, and your mailbox appears to be tilted imperceptibly, but tilted nonetheless. I smiled a little too wide and stepped aside. Please come in, I said, though my gut told me letting her inside might be a mistake. She didn't even step in. Instead, she wandered around the yard like she was on a safari, taking notes, measuring, squinting, and occasionally muttering about future violations. I tried small talk, because what else do you do when someone has gone full villain mode in your driveway? Lovely weather, I said. Karen ignored me. I noticed your rose bushes are doing very well. I continued, hoping flattery might save the day. Still nothing. She was so focused on her clipboard that she barely noticed me standing there. She even took out a tape measure and started packing like she was preparing for an Olympic event. And that's when she said the words I knew would haunt me. I may have to escalate this to ensure compliance. Escalate, that word sounded innocent until it didn't. My mind raced. Could she really do anything? Sure, she could file fines, send letters, and email me at all hours of the night, but escalation? That implied action beyond paperwork. Action that might require, I don't know, showing up unannounced at 7 a.m., armed with righteous indignation. And then it hit me, that was exactly what she was planning. Over the next few days, I noticed little signs that Karen's obsession had crossed into full-blown mania. My neighbors started giving me subtle looks, some sympathetic, others amused. One even whispered, "You're lucky she hasn't called in a SWAT team for your mailbox yet." I laughed at first, but deep down I worried. One evening around dusk, I heard a car pull up. There was a soft knock at my door. I peeked through the blinds. Sure enough, it was her, Karen, hovering at my entrance like a vulture with a clipboard. She looked unshakable, convinced she had divine authority over my house. I opened the door slowly. "Evening, Karen, everything all right?" She didn't respond. Instead, she started measuring the spacing between my garden stones, muttering about alignment and community standards. I tried to step in, politely suggesting she stay on the sidewalk. "I'm just making sure everything is compliant," she said, flashing that infuriatingly confident smirk. I tried to reason with her. "Karen, I really don't think you should be." Before I could finish, she waved her hand dismissively. "I have a duty. I will ensure compliance at all costs." At that moment, something inside me clicked. I realized Karen didn't just want to enforce rules. She wanted power, she wanted control, and nothing, not emails, not polite conversation, would stop her. The suspense was almost unbearable. I felt like a character in a horror movie, except instead of a masked killer, my antagonist carried clipboards and wielded HOA authority. Every time I thought the nightmare would end, it escalated. Little did I know, this obsession of hers would soon collide with real law enforcement. Because Karen wasn't just targeting my gnome anymore. She was about to trespass into territory she didn't even understand, the sheriff's property. And when that happened, well, let's just say things were about to get very interesting. I thought I had seen the worst of Karen, but I was wrong. That Friday morning started like any other. Birds chirping, coffee brewing, and me thinking I could finally enjoy a quiet weekend. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over my gravel driveway. I peeked through the blinds. Of course, Karen, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, looking like a general ready to conquer foreign territory. My first instinct was to hide, but hiding from Karen only prolongs the inevitable. And trust me, she always finds you. I opened the door, trying to sound casual. "Morning, Karen, everything all right?" She didn't answer. She stepped inside my yard without waiting for an invitation, measuring tape in hand, eyes scanning every inch of my lawn like I had committed a crime. "Your gnome is still not compliant," she said without a hint of humor. "And this spacing of your stepping stones, unacceptable." I blinked. "Unacceptable, really?" I tried to keep my voice calm, but I felt the tension rising. "It's a lawn, Karen, not the Pentagon." Her eyes narrowed. "The HOA has standards. Standards must be enforced. Compliance is mandatory." I swallowed hard. This was no longer about a gnome or stepping stones. This was about control, about ego. About Karen believing she had the right to dictate every corner of my property. I tried reasoning. "Karen, I don't think you can just walk onto my property uninvited, maybe." Her finger shot up, cutting me off. "I am authorized to ensure compliance. I am performing my duties." At this point, I noticed something. The edge of her clipboard nearly brushing the fence that separated my yard from the next property, and that's when my stomach sank. I remembered the house next door wasn't just any neighbor. That was Sheriff Thompson's property, local law enforcement. The same man who oversaw our small community and, more importantly, had zero patience for trespassers. My pulse quickened. Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "you're really close to the sheriff's property line." Karen didn't hear me. She was too busy taking notes, muttering about alignment and property aesthetics. One foot stepped over the invisible boundary before I could stop her. Karen, stop, I shouted, running toward her. She froze for just a moment, then turned with that smug, self-righteous expression that said, I'm above all rules. Relax, she said, I'm just ensuring compliance. I opened my mouth to argue further, but before I could, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. Ma'am, step back from my property. Karen froze, the clipboard slipped slightly from her hands. Her sunglasses were now useless because her eyes were wide, staring straight at the owner of the voice. Sheriff Thompson in person, tall, imposing, and not remotely amused. Karen stammered, the words catching in her throat. Her confidence, the same one that had fueled weeks of terrorizing the neighborhood, was crumbling. I couldn't help but feel a surge of relief mixed with amusement. I mean, come on, Karen had finally met someone who wasn't going to cower in emails and passive-aggressive notes. She was staring down real authority, and she didn't even realize it. The sheriff continued, calm but firm. I suggest you step back onto your property immediately, or this will no longer be a civil matter. Karen's lips trembled. She looked like a child caught sneaking cookies from the jar. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Instead, she tried to recover, lifting her clipboard like a shield. I'm just performing my duties. You're trespassing, the sheriff said simply. The tension in the yard was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I could barely breathe from holding back laughter. Finally, Karen muttered something about rules and retreated, stepping sheepishly back onto my side of the property. As she backed away, scribbling furiously on her clipboard like her life depended on it, I realized something important. Karen wasn't just ridiculous, she was dangerous. Not in a physical sense, at least not yet, but in the way obsessive people can become blinded by their own sense of authority. And the worst part, I knew this was far from over. Karen would be back, she always came back, but now she had a new complication, trespassing on the sheriff. That little misstep would change everything. And me, I had a front row seat to the chaos. I walked back inside, trying to calm my racing heart. I laughed softly to myself, shaking my head. Well, I thought, this is officially out of control, and I have a feeling things are only going to get more interesting. After the sheriff's intervention, I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would take the hint. Maybe she'd realize that some lines aren't meant to be crossed, that there are limits to HOA power, and that trespassing on law enforcement property is a very bad idea. I was wrong. The next Monday, I noticed her car parked down the street before I even got out of bed. That unmistakable glare from behind the windshield made my stomach tighten. Karen wasn't just persistent, she was relentless. And now, after the sheriff incident, I had a front row seat to her obsession turning dangerous. I grabbed my coffee, peered out the blinds, and watched her approach. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched as if she were about to take control of the entire street. She paused at my property line, looked at the gnome, then glanced in my direction as if daring me to say something. I opened the door cautiously. Morning, Karen, I said, forcing calm into my voice. I hope today's visit isn't about the gnome again. She didn't answer. She strode past me, ignoring my attempts at civility. Her clipboard clutched like a weapon. She began packing my yard with that hyper-focused energy that made it clear this wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about proving a point. I followed at a safe distance, careful not to get too close. Karen, I said, trying again, I really don't think you should. I'm ensuring compliance, she interrupted sharply, waving her hand dismissively. I have a duty to the HOA. At that moment, I noticed something odd. Her foot was dangerously close to the fence line again, the very same one that marked Sheriff Thompson's property. My heart rate spiked. I knew I needed to stop her before this escalated into something far worse. Karen, step back, that's private property, I shouted, running toward her. She froze for a second, but then shrugged, clearly convinced she knew better than both me and the sheriff. I am allowed to make inspections, it's my duty. I groaned inwardly, this was going to be a long day. Suddenly, I remembered something crucial. My neighbor, the sheriff, was home today. I could see his truck parked in the driveway. That meant if Karen stepped 1 inch over the line, well, the consequences would be immediate and not at all pleasant. I tried reasoning again, my voice rising slightly. Karen, seriously, you do not want to do this, trust me. She ignored me completely. My pulse quickened as she took another step forward. At that moment, the absurdity of the situation hit me. Here was a woman, full of ego and misplaced authority, about to make the worst decision of her HOA career, and all I could do was watch in horror and disbelief. And then it happened. Her foot crossed the invisible boundary. I froze, my mouth open, as she looked around as if everything was normal. She didn't even notice the movement in the driveway, Sheriff Thompson stepping outside, his expression calm but unmistakably serious. "Karen," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying that kind of authority that makes you realize you've made a huge mistake. Karen jumped, her clipboard slipped slightly from her grasp. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across her face. That confidence, the one that had fueled weeks of intimidation, started to crumble. I'm just," she stammered, clearly unprepared to deal with real consequences. "You're trespassing," the sheriff said simply. "No yelling, no theatrics, just the quiet certainty that comes from absolute authority. Step back onto your property right now." Her hands flew to the clipboard as if it could save her from the reality she had just stepped into. I could barely hold back laughter. This was surreal, the ultimate clash of HOA delusion versus real law enforcement. Karen muttered something about rules and duty, but her voice lacked conviction. She slowly retreated inch by inch like a child caught in the act. Every step she took was a tiny victory for me and a massive embarrassment for her. I finally exhaled, a mixture of relief and amusement washing over me. Karen had been stopped, but just barely, and the tension didn't completely leave the air. I knew she would be back, that her obsession wasn't over, and that the next move could be even crazier. For now, I stepped inside, took a deep sip of coffee, and shook my head. Suburban life had just turned into something I could never have imagined. A gnome, a clipboard, and an overzealous HOA president, this was not the weekend I had planned. And yet I couldn't help but smirk. Things were about to get even more interesting. I thought Karen had learned her lesson. I really did. But suburban legends have a way of proving you wrong, and Karen was quickly becoming a legend in her own right, though probably not the kind she hoped for. It started that Saturday morning. I was sipping coffee on the porch, enjoying the rare silence, when I noticed her car creeping down the street. Not stopping this time, she was parked a block away, watching, plotting like a hawk circling prey. My stomach sank. Whatever she had planned, it wasn't going to be small. And I was right. By mid-morning, she was at my property line again, clipboard in hand, glasses glinting in the sun. I tried to prepare myself mentally. Okay, I thought, this time I'll just stay calm, let her waste her energy on nonsense. Maybe she'll finally go home. But calm didn't stand a chance. Karen strutted into my yard as if she owned it. She ignored my protests entirely. "I am here to ensure compliance," she declared. Her tone had that theatrical quality I had come to both dread and mock in my head. I followed cautiously, trying not to antagonize her further. "Karen, really, you shouldn't." She didn't hear me, not at all. Her focus was total, obsessive, and frightening. She was measuring, inspecting, packing, completely oblivious to anything else. And then I realized she was moving dangerously close to the sheriff's property again. My heart jumped. Sheriff Thompson's truck was gone this time, but that didn't matter. One misstep and she would have legal consequences she couldn't laugh her way out of. I tried a new approach. "Karen," I said firmly, "step back, you're crossing into restricted territory, please stop." She waved her hand dismissively. "I have authority," she said. "Compliance must be enforced." At that moment, I had a flash of clarity. This wasn't just about rules. This was about ego, control, the feeling of power over others, no matter how absurd it might be, and that meant Karen wasn't going to back down voluntarily. Then it happened. She stepped off my property line and onto the sheriff's land, unknowingly, dangerously, and completely oblivious. I froze, my brain screamed at me to intervene, but I was powerless. This was Karen's cliff, and she was free-falling. Then from behind the tall oak tree came a voice, calm, measured, and deadly serious. "Ma'am, step back immediately." Karen froze, her clipboard wobbled in her hands. She turned slowly, eyes wide, and that overconfident smirk she wore for weeks vanished entirely. There he was, Sheriff Thompson, standing tall, arms crossed, expression calm but intimidating. Karen's reaction was priceless. She opened her mouth, closed it, muttered something about rules, then tried to regain composure, but it was too late. The look on the sheriff's face was enough to stop anyone in their tracks. "I suggest you step back onto your property," the sheriff said, his tone leaving no room for debate, "or this becomes a legal matter." Karen's hands flew to her clipboard like it was a shield, but her resolve was crumbling. For weeks, she had imagined herself untouchable above petty laws, unstoppable in her mission to enforce HOA rules. Now, in the face of real authority, she looked small, flustered, and honestly a little pathetic. I watched from the porch, trying to suppress laughter and panic at the same time. This was insane. My neighbor had just become the ultimate wildcard in a suburban feud over a gnome and stepping stones, and I was witnessing it firsthand. Karen muttered something about compliance, her voice shaky. Slowly, reluctantly, she stepped back onto my property. Her eyes darted nervously between me and the sheriff. For once, she seemed aware that her power had limits. I let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding me. Well, I thought, that's over, right? Wrong, because Karen's obsession didn't end with humiliation. She would be back, she always came back, and I had a feeling that next time her obsession would take an even crazier turn, one that might actually involve the sheriff more directly. For now, though, I allowed myself a small victory. I had survived Karen's delusions once more, and the gnome was safe. The stepping stones remained unscathed, and suburban life, at least temporarily, returned to something resembling normal. But deep down, I knew this was just the calm before the storm. And when Karen came back, things were going to get even more chaotic, ridiculous, and undeniably dramatic. I thought I had seen the peak of Karen's insanity, but suburban life has a way of proving you wrong. That Monday morning, I was sipping my coffee, hopping for peace when I saw her car again. Of course, there was no subtlety in her approach this time. She was marching down the street like she owned the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the sun like a badge of authority. I felt my stomach tighten. My first instinct was to hide inside, but I had learned something from our previous encounters. Hiding only prolongs the inevitable. And besides, this time I couldn't just watch from the porch. I needed to be ready for whatever absurd escalation Karen had cooked up. She arrived at my property line, clipboard in front of her like a shield, muttering about violations and community standards. I stepped outside cautiously. Karen, I said, trying to keep my tone calm, please, let's not repeat last weekend. No stepping past the line, all right? She ignored me entirely. Instead, she strode onto my lawn with the precision of a military officer inspecting recruits. Her eyes were fixed on the gnome, the mailbox, the stepping stones, nothing else existed. I followed at a safe distance, my nerves buzzing. Karen, seriously, you can't just. I am authorized to enforce compliance, she said sharply, waving her hand dismissively. This is my duty. I groaned inwardly. Your duty is about to get you in real trouble, I muttered under my breath. And then the inevitable happened. She crossed over the property line, again stepping onto Sheriff Thompson's land. My heart dropped. I knew the sheriff was home because his truck was in the driveway. One wrong move now, and Karen would be in so much trouble it wasn't even funny, though in my head I admit it was a little funny. I shouted, Karen, step back. She froze for a split second, then waved her hand as if she was dismissing my concerns. I have a right to inspect, compliance must be ensured. I could feel my panic rising. I realized at that moment just how reckless she had become. Her obsession with rules had completely overridden her sense of reason. And then from the driveway, the calm, steady voice cut through the tension. Ma'am, you need to step back immediately. Karen froze, my eyes widened. I had been hoping the sheriff might intervene, but hearing it for the first time was surreal. She turned slowly, realizing far too late who was speaking. Sheriff Thompson, tall, imposing, and not remotely amused. Her smug, self-righteous expression faltered. I could see the panic flicker in her eyes. For weeks, she had imagined herself untouchable, unstoppable above everyone else's petty rules. Now she was staring down real authority, and it wasn't going to bend for her. You're trespassing, the sheriff said simply, voice calm, but with a weight that made it clear there would be consequences. Step back onto your property now. Karen's hands flew to her clipboard as if it could shield her from the reality of what she had done. She stammered something about rules and duty, but it came out weak and incoherent. I watched, half in disbelief and half in relief, as she slowly, reluctantly retreated. Every step she took back onto my property felt like a small victory. For once, her ego had a visible crack in it. I could barely suppress a laugh, though I knew better than to make eye contact. Karen was flustered, red-faced, muttering about violations and compliance as if retreating would somehow save her pride. Once she was safely back on my side of the fence, I exhaled, relief washing over me. The tension in the air was almost tangible, like it had been compressed for weeks and finally released. Karen had been stopped, humiliated, and yet I knew this wasn't over. She would return, she always did. Her obsession was far from over, and now she had a new lesson burned into her memory. Authority isn't something you can bluff your way past, not even in an HOA. For now, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. My gnome was safe, my stepping stones remained in place, and Karen had finally met someone who wouldn't be swayed by her self-importance. I sipped my coffee, shaking my head with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. Suburban life had become something out of a sitcom, a gnome, an overzealous HOA president, and a sheriff standing like the ultimate referee in this absurd drama. But deep down, I knew the calm wouldn't last. Karen's obsession wouldn't allow it, and when she returned, the next encounter would be bigger, crazier, and even more dramatic. I thought the worst of Karen's delusions had finally been stopped. She had been embarrassed, flustered, and most importantly, told in no uncertain terms that stepping onto the sheriff's property was a terrible idea. I allowed myself a small victory until Monday morning rolled around. Her car was back, parked further down the street this time as if she was trying to be sneaky. I watched through the blinds, coffee in hand, hoping my imagination was exaggerating. But no, it was her. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, plotting her next move like a general preparing for battle. I sighed. There was no peace in this neighborhood anymore. Karen didn't come at me directly at first. She lingered at the edge of my yard, packing and muttering under her breath. I could barely hear the words, but I knew she was writing something on that clipboard, another list, another violation report, another attempt to assert authority over the world. I tried reasoning, Karen, maybe we can talk this out. She ignored me. That was when I noticed she was creeping dangerously close to the fence again, the same invisible line that marked the sheriff's property. My heart skipped. Sheriff Thompson was home this time, and I knew one misstep could turn Karen's obsession into a serious problem. I moved toward her, trying to block her path. Karen, seriously, step back, you don't want to do this. She glanced at me briefly with that same smug look that had gotten her into trouble weeks ago. I am authorized to inspect your property, she said, her voice quivering slightly but still trying to sound confident. Compliance must be ensured. I groaned. Her confidence was fragile now, but she still hadn't learned. And then it happened. 1 foot crossed the property line again. I froze. This time I wasn't just watching absurdity unfold, I was waiting for disaster. From the driveway, a familiar, calm, firm voice broke the tension. Karen, step back. She froze instantly. My stomach dropped. There he was, Sheriff Thompson, arms crossed, expression unreadable, standing tall. Karen's clipboard wobbled in her hands. For the first time, I saw true fear in her eyes. She stammered, trying to recover. Her words faltered, trailing into incomprehensible mumbling. You're trespassing, the sheriff said simply. Step back onto your property immediately. Her retreat was slow and awkward, as if the very act of moving backward contradicted the rules she had sworn to uphold. I watched, half in horror, half in disbelief, as Karen scribbled furiously on her clipboard like it could erase reality. Once she was safely back on my side of the fence, she froze, looking around as if searching for backup for an army of HOA minions to rescue her. There was nothing. Just her, me, and the sheriff, who had already returned to the comfort of his property, silently asserting authority without a word. I let out a shaky laugh, relief and disbelief flooding me at once. Karen had finally met her match. The woman who had terrified a neighborhood with emails, notes, and lectures was reduced to muttering about violations and duties in a defeated whisper. I knew the fallout would be interesting. Word spreads fast in small neighborhoods, and this encounter wasn't something that would stay private for long. Neighbors would hear, maybe even the HOA board would start questioning Karen's methods. And I had a front row seat to the chaos, enjoying every absurd moment. For now, the gnome was safe. The mailbox remained crooked only in spirit, and my stepping stones remained exactly where they belonged. Karen had been stopped, humiliated, and most importantly, reminded that some rules are not meant to be enforced at the expense of common sense or the law. I finally walked back inside, took a deep breath, and sipped my coffee. Suburban life, I realized, had just handed me one of the strangest stories I would ever witness. A gnome, a clipboard, an overzealous HOA president, and a sheriff standing like a referee in the most ridiculous showdown imaginable. I knew one thing for certain: Karen might return, but the lesson had been learned. Authority, real authority, cannot be faked. Ego cannot substitute for law. And the sheriff, well, he had made sure that lesson would stick, and I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction knowing I'd witnessed it firsthand. As I set down my coffee, I smiled. Life in this neighborhood would never be boring again. Karen had finally learned that there are limits, even for someone who believes their clipboard holds the power of the universe. By the time Karen finally retreated that day, I felt a mixture of relief, disbelief, and quiet amusement. I had survived weeks of escalating absurdity, the emails, the texts, the passive-aggressive letters, the surprise inspections, and of course, the unforgettable trespassing incident on the sheriff's property. Honestly, I wasn't sure whether to laugh or keep a first aid kit ready for my sanity. I stepped out onto the porch, surveying my yard. My gnome was still standing proudly, the mailbox was crooked in the most defiant way possible, and the stepping stones were perfectly imperfect. Everything was exactly how it should be, and for the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt normal, at least as normal as it could be when Karen existed. The news of Karen's latest misadventure spread quickly. Neighbors who had quietly endured her tirades now whispered behind closed doors, shaking their heads, sharing glances that said, "Can you believe she actually trespassed on the sheriff's property?" Some even chuckled openly. I couldn't blame them. The story was ridiculous, almost cartoonish, yet painfully real. As for Karen, I heard she was summoned for a formal HOA review. Apparently, the board finally realized that her obsession with micromanaging everyone's yards had gone too far. I wasn't sure what consequences she faced, but the fact that she had finally been confronted by both the sheriff and the HOA board gave me a small sense of justice. I reflected on the absurdity of it all. Who knew that a simple garden gnome could spark such chaos? Who would have thought that HOA rules, a clipboard, and an overzealous neighbor could lead to a standoff involving law enforcement? And yet here we were. My little suburban life had turned into a full-blown drama worthy of a sitcom or maybe a cautionary tale. I also thought about Karen herself. Part of me felt pity. Clearly, her need to control everything was deeper than just being overbearing. It was obsession dressed up as authority, but another part of me couldn't help but laugh at how spectacularly she had been humbled. The woman who thought she could enforce compliance with emails and passive-aggressive threats had finally met someone, Sheriff Thompson, who reminded her that some authority can't be faked. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to a quieter rhythm. Karen still patrolled the neighborhood in her car occasionally, but she seemed more cautious, more aware that stepping too far over the line literally had consequences. I watched from my porch sipping coffee, a small smile playing on my lips. The gnome stood proudly in the yard, a silent guardian of my sanity and a symbol of small victories won through patience, wit, and a little luck. I even started joking with my neighbors. "At least Karen hasn't tried to measure my lawn again this week," I'd say, and they'd chuckle, knowing full well that Karen's obsession would always be a part of the neighborhood lore. We had survived her tyranny together, and somehow that made us closer. And me, I had learned a few lessons myself. First, never underestimate the power of ego and obsession, especially in small communities where everyone thinks they're in charge. Second, humor is essential when dealing with absurdity. If I had let stress and anger dominate my reaction, Karen's antics might have ruined my peace entirely. Instead, I survived with my sanity intact, even finding moments to laugh at the ridiculousness unfolding right outside my door. Finally, I learned that sometimes the rules are less important than common sense. And occasionally, it takes a sheriff, a clipboard-wielding narcissist, and a little courage to remind people of that fact. So now, when I sit on my porch in the morning, watching the neighborhood wake up, I feel a quiet satisfaction. Karen may return with new rules, new complaints, or new obsessions, but I'm ready. The gnome, the mailbox, the stepping stones, they're all still here, and so am I, and if Karen ever thinks about testing the limits again, she's in for a surprise. Because suburban life may be peaceful most of the time, but in my little corner of the world, drama, humor, and absurdity are never far away. And after everything, I've learned to enjoy the show. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.